Good morning. Today is the 5th Sunday of Lent. The sermon is titled A Clean Heart. It is based on Psalm 51, verses 1 through 12. In today's psalm is the prayer, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and restore a right spirit within me." Oh, a clean heart, a renewed spirit. Tradition ascribes this psalm to King David and says he composed it after he is confronted by the prophet Nathan for committing adultery and then using his power to have a man killed to cover up his own wrongdoing. The writer of the Psalms feels the weight of his weakness very deeply. He feels disconnected from God. The image he uses to express his reconciliation, for connection, for restoration of his right relationship with God, is his heart's need for cleansing. His weakness has soiled his heart, and thus he calls out, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit in me." What would we do with a clean heart, a renewed spirit, a second chance? In the Old Testament lesson, God says that the prophet Jeremiah, who writes that God's will, that God's law on the people's heart and forgives their transgressions. In a passage from Ezekiel, God promises an even more radical surgery. I quote, "I will give them a new heart and I will put a new spirit within them. I will remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh," unquote. Oh, what would we do with a clean heart, a new spirit, another chance? In Ann Tyler's novel, Saint Maybe, a character named Ian bears a terrible burden of guilt. He has carelessly expressed the idea that his brother's wife has committed adultery, an unfounded idea. Ian's speech is born out of an anger against his brother and sister-in-law, and it leads to their deaths. They're leaving behind 3 children, and an aching pain in Ian knowing he bears responsibility for how things turned out. He longs to be set free from his burden, to experience true forgiveness. Ian finds his way to a church where the minister tells him that he indeed needs to accept responsibility for his brother's 3 children. In caring and raising these children, Ian realizes that any forgiveness worth having needs to be linked to a change in his life. His problem is that he sees forgiveness as something he must earn. He leads a very upright life, but he cuts himself off from others. He becomes distant from people, even himself. He wonders why, with all the good works he's been doing, all the atoning, it still feels like God hasn't forgiven him. Ian has been busy trying to earn his forgiveness, and it's not working. He lives in such a way as to avoid making mistakes. One of the children teases him, saying, "King, careful. Mister, look both ways." Saint Maybe. Ian feels he has a second chance, but he also feels he must be very cautious. Since he thinks forgiveness depends upon himself, his own ability to make things right, he can only live in a closed and cut off way, a way that prevents him from experiencing the fullness of life, from taking risks for the sake of love. He has become a man of upright behavior. He has taken a job as a cabinet maker, taking refuge in inanimate objects so he doesn't have to deal with people, not risking hurting or being hurt. What we hear in this lesson is, in the gospel lesson, is that in Jesus we know someone who not only knows our weaknesses, but who does something about them. When we meet Jesus in the gospel lesson, Jesus is on his way to the cross. He gives this promise, quote, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all the people to myself," unquote. Our weaknesses separate us from God, from others, ourselves, and our world. When Jesus is lifted upon the cross, he will set in motion the reconciliation of all people, the forgiveness of all people, the drawing of all people to himself. It is a picture of reconciliation or of the healing of broken relationships. Relationships with God, with our family members and friends and community members, and our own selves. It's not about giving us a chance to earn forgiveness. Since our hearts need cleansing, God is the one to do it. And through Jesus, we can have a clean heart again. So the question is not, what would you do with a second chance? In giving us new life, Jesus also gives us a way to respond, a pattern of a new life. It is not about living in a cautious and closed-off way. Jesus' way of life is one of taking risks, of reaching out to others, of serving the poor, of working for justice, of being reconciled with others, of being like the poor, of being also like grains of wheat that multiply if they are willing to give up the certainty of being seeds for the adventure of growth and new life and the spreading of blessings. What will you do with a new heart, a clean heart? Eventually in St. Maybe, Ian begins to discover God's grace in the ordinary details of life. He begins opening to risk, to relationship, to healing. He discovers that the 3 children are not a burden. They give his life color and energy and meaning. Ian finds a new woman and falls in love, and they marry. He uses his carpentry skills to build a cradle for their new baby. And through this effort, done in response to love, Ian discovers something new, and he takes a risk. Ian realized that through being forgiven and forgiving, through being given a clean heart and a second chance, of learning the importance of vulnerability and taking risks, he opened to new love and new life and new hope. The response to being forgiven, to being given a clean heart and a new spirit, and more, to the life of Jesus, walking in his ways, following where he leads, being willing to spend it all, and taking the risk to give up the certainty of being a seed for the adventure of new life and new growth and new possibilities. Thanks be to God. Amen.